Good morning, everyone. It's such a treat for me to do this introduction, and I'm so pleased to see so many old and new faces joining us this morning. So I'm very pleased to introduce Kelsey Utne, who moments from now will be completing her dissertation. She is an extremely prolific and accomplished scholar. She is being funded this year as an ACLS Mellon Scholar. She is also an experienced prison education program who's worked very closely with the Cornell Prison Education Program. And she's also a digital humanist. This paper is a small slice of what she does, which is a longer project on necropolitics and corpse politics across the South Asian subcontinent and diaspora. Today's subject is an unlawful object of gathering, stealing a corpse in 1927 Delhi. Before I turn it over to Kelsey, I'll just remind you, I think Kelsey will talk for about 40 minutes and then we'll have some Q&A afterward, which we can do in chat and also in person. But with that, I am so pleased to invite Kelsey to take over and take us away.
Great, thank you so much, everyone. Let me just get my screen sharing set up here. And all right. So first off, I just want to say thank you so much, Durba, for the introduction, to the Cornell Einaudi Center's South Asia program for inviting me to talk about my research today, Daniel and Gloria for organizing and putting this together. Before I start talking about my research, I just would like to briefly acknowledge that Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayokono, the Cayuga Nation. The Gayokono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of the Gayokono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of the Gayokono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. All right, so I would like to set us up with the story that we'll be delving into more deeply over the next 40 or so minutes. When Abdul Rashid was finally executed for murder in November 1927, there was already a crowd outside the Delhi jail gates. About an hour after he was hanged, prison authorities admitted members of his family to wash his body and prepare it for burial. Delhi officials became increasingly alarmed as the crowds outside continued to swell in size, as hundreds, some said even thousands, of the city's Muslims gathered. While some lauded Rashid's murder of Arya Samaj leader Swami Shraddhanan the prior December, many more felt that the justice system cared more about the death of Hindus than of Muslims. Just before noon, Rashid's relatives left the ground. They were carrying the funeral bier on their shoulders, headed to the cemetery less than a kilometer to the south. But they barely reached the road when members of the crowd took hold of the body, bier, shroud, and all. Before police could intervene, the crowd took Rashid's body northward into Delhi's Old City. They swung west to Jama Masjid, where they paused for an instant as if they intended to lower the body and pray before rushing straight out the other side, the authorities in hot pursuit. They turned north again towards Fatehpuri Masjid, and then as they were on the bridge, crossing the railroad tracks, the illicit procession came to a sudden halt, army trucks blocking the way. Police seized Abdul Rashid's corpse and arrested dozens on the spot. In the end, over 130 people were arrested in the so-called riot, the majority of which were charged. So this presentation asks, how did this happen? How was it that an unorganized crowd stole the body of a convicted murderer, forcing city authorities into a mission to forcibly reclaim the criminal corpse? And importantly, what does this incident tell us about the necrogeography and necropolitics of 1920s Delhi? As a brief roadmap to how we're going to proceed through this today. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the assassination of Swami Shraddhanand, for which Abdul Rashid was convicted, the geographical constraints on the Delhi government in terms of how they carried out the execution, both physical and human geography. We'll revisit briefly the execution itself in terms of how it was carried out and the corpse theft afterwards. And then in the latter portions, we're going to delve into what were the alternatives? What are the things that didn't happen but were imagined by these different communities, in particular the Delhi Muslim community, as far as how the locations in the city related to death and burial relate to one another. And then how those choices were closed off by colonial infrastructure projects, almost by accident rather than by effective governance. So a little background on the assassination and really on the assassin. Who was Abdul Rashid? What did he do? We don't know a ton about Abdul Rashid, truth be told. We know that he was about 50 years old. We know that he was educated, given his employment record, admittedly spotty, as a copy editor for publications in Delhi, as well as Lahore and Kabul. According to the Times of India, he described himself as a, quote, zealous Muhammadan whose heart burned for Islam. This is in keeping with what we know about the fact that in 1920, he was one of the many Indian Muslims who went to Afghanistan in support of the Caliphate movement. But we also know that, like a lot of them, he returned to India, and he was back in Delhi by the end of 1923. We don't know exactly when. He had at least 2 adult children, and a few months before murdering Shraddhanand, he had divorced for the 4th time against his family's wishes. Now, multiple sources, including Shraddhanand himself, reported that towards the end of 1926, he was deeply concerned about Hindu religious campaigns, most notably the Shuddhi movement, which launched on a large scale, coincidentally, maybe not, the same year Rashid returned from Afghanistan. Spearheaded by the Arya Samaj leader, Swami Shraddhanand. For those who aren't familiar, the Shuddhi campaign aimed to, quote, reconvert Muslims, largely in the United Provinces, back to Hinduism. It framed them as victims of Islamic expansion who required rescue and protection, required being brought back into the Hindu fold. Rashid, it seems, felt compelled to take matters into his own hands. He may have felt this may have been a particularly personal issue for him, in that we know he and his family hailed from Western UP, just east of Delhi. And so the areas where this campaign was taking place may have been impacting people he knew and was connected with. In any case, he ultimately chose to go to the office of Shraddhanand on December 23rd, 1926, where he shot and killed Swami Shraddhanand. At the time that Rashid went to Shraddhanand's office, he arrived around 4 p.m. and came under the excuse that he needed to talk to Shraddhanand, who was quite ill and bedbound at this point in time, that he wanted to discuss and potentially debate these Hindu campaigns. Under the guise of needing a glass of water, he got Shraddhanand alone, sending the servant away, at which point in time he shot Shraddhanand 4 times in the chest and shoulder before Shraddhanand's servant and secretary, Dharampal Singh, returned and tackled him to the ground, held him there until help arrived. In the hours immediately following Shraddhanand's death, Delhi's shops closed, bracing for potential violence between the city's Hindus and Muslims. And to an extent, those fears were borne out, at least one fight left. I believe it was 1 Muslim killed, 5 in the hospital, 1 Hindu in custody. The death of the Muslim Mufti Mahbub Ali in those riots or fights, I'll say, right after Shraddhanand's murder, are later pointed to by the Muslim community as a death of a Muslim on the same day that ultimately goes unsolved, and those charged were committed or acquitted in the end. In the days and weeks following the murder, though, the press and Congress leaders labeled Rashid a madman, a fanatic, unhinged assassin, a lunatic. And his lawyers tried unsuccessfully to exploit that language, claiming that he was insane and unfit to stand trial. On appeal, the High Court upheld Rashid's conviction. In the decision, they wrote that even if the accused is conceited, odd, and irascible, and his brain was not quite all right, it cannot be said that he was incapable of knowing that murder was wrong. He was going to be hanged, which brings us now to the geographic constraints that played into the events that followed, created the conditions that permitted this corpse theft to occur. So who gives control of the incarcerated corpse? Someone dies in jail, what happens to the body? This is a logistical question, ultimately, that needs to be handled in the process of planning a judicial execution. According to procedural manuals in British India, colonial prisons were to hand over the bodies of the dead to relatives or friends when requested, regardless of manner of death, whether the individual died in the gallows, by suicide, accident, illness, hunger strike. There were, though, 2 primary exceptions to this. The first had to do with how the individual died. Specifically, was it by contagious disease, something like cholera or plague? If so, then the body would not be released and would be disposed of in a way to protect public health. We can see how these sorts of measures were part of the debate in the early days of the pandemic. What do you do with a body when it might be contagious? And so in this case, the policy was very straightforward. Death by contagious disease, don't release the body. If they died for a non-contagious reason, then a second question arose. Was the funeral at risk for becoming a public protest, devolving into a demonstration, devolving in quotes there? And the magistrate was ultimately the one who was supposed to make this decision of judgment. If he determined that there was not a risk to the public order, then no problem, release the body to friends, relatives, whoever it was had requested, and they are able to dispose of the body as they see fit. However, if there was considered to be a threat to public safety, then we return to the don't release the body option. And we have this equating of public safety, public health collapsing in these judgment calls, one of which is sort of more straightforward as far as contagious disease, the other one much more subjective. Does the magistrate think something is likely? In the case of Rashid's execution, officials were worried that there would be mass gatherings and a potential for violence. After all, as I mentioned already, in the immediate aftermath of Shraddhanand's murder, there were clashes in the city. People did end up in the hospital. One did die. And so was it possible, they wondered, to execute Rashid somewhere other than Delhi, anywhere but here? And for a brief window, that did seem possible. They were negotiations with Punjab, which Delhi had previously technically been part of in the colonial structure of governance. But with the appeal and a number of other delays, by the time they were going to arrange for this execution at an undisclosed location in the Punjab in late spring to midsummer, it just wasn't an option anymore. Confluence of events, including a number of communal disruptions in the Punjab, sort of squashed that plan. Punjab said, you know what, we do not need any more touchy subjects happening here. This is your problem, you can keep it. But the Delhi execution raised another problem. The jail didn't have its own burial ground. As you might imagine, based on the flowchart that I showed you a couple slides ago, this is kind of a problem if you have policies already about keeping a body or releasing a body. And it was in direct contradiction with the mandate that all jails in Punjab and really most of colonial India have their own burial ground, if not also their own cremation ground. And yet the Delhi jail, which had been in that location since the mid-19th century, had no burial ground within its property. It had death sites. It had sort of its own internal necrogeography on a micro level, but no actual burial or cremation grounds. The necrogeography of the facility itself was limited to the gallows for execution and the mortuary or dead house for preparing bodies for disposal. According to jail officials, some of the Muslim burial grounds in the area, though, weren't just close by, they were actually encroaching on the grounds of the jail itself. And so there was a sense of proximity and convenience where there were burial grounds abutting the property and almost closing it in to an extent, preventing further expansion. But it still does raise the question, even with those ones right there, how had the jail gotten by without its own burial ground for so many decades? So I mentioned sort of by happenstance, it was very conveniently located to a number of sites for corpse disposal. Not far from the Yamuna River, and the banks of which could be used for cremation, as well as a number of burial sites, including even a Parsi cemetery for Zoroastrian burial, which I'll, before I start to get questions, yes, towers of silence, but also burial. Happy to talk about that in the Q&A. And so on this map here, you see a number of burial grounds identified, and there are actually even more in that area. These are just the ones that are indicated on one particular 1912 map. Later, when defending their actions, Delhi officials also pointed to this geography as saying it made them uniquely vulnerable to large crowds, saying that the jail and the cemetery are surrounded by open country on all sides, so that access to the spot is easy and practically impossible to prevent. And so we see that this geography at once gave them an out for fulfilling a requirement, as well as being unable to prevent the assault on the grounds. So to revisit the execution itself, in an effort to prevent the sort of protest that I would have actually, in an effort to prevent a protest, prison officials required that Rashid's body or Rashid's family agree to certain terms in order to receive his body. They had to agree there would be no procession of any sort, and they had to agree that they would wash and prepare the body for burial at the prison itself. The family had tried to negotiate for bringing Rashid's body home for preparation. This would have been common practice. Most bodies were prepared at home rather than here in the US. We're often familiar with funeral parlors being the ones that prepare the body, but that request was denied. Ultimately, the family agreed to the state's terms in order that they could dispose of the body as they felt fit. The government dug a grave the night before to facilitate a quick and rapid funeral, but the planned Delhi authorities committed to showed signs of weakness early on. Starting with the fact that 2 days beforehand, there had been a rumor that Rashid had already been executed, and over 1,000 people came and joined outside of the prison before being dispersed and told that the execution, in fact, had not taken place yet. Now, you might have noted that I caught myself when I said what kind of protest they were trying to prevent. And that's because they remained convinced that any unrest related to Rashid's execution and burial would happen after the burial, after the funeral. To quote the Chief Commissioner of Delhi, in view of the very careful arrangements taken to ensure that the burial conformed in every way to the rites accorded to ordinary Muslims, it was not thought so probable that any disturbance would take place at the cemetery as on the return of the spectators from the burial ground to the city. And so we see in this the logic that as long as the mechanics of ritual and of the Muslim faith are fulfilled, then that is a matter resolved. And so they were not anticipating any sort of unrest until after the burial had taken place itself. So just to give you a little bit more detail on that timeline. The execution was at 8 a.m. Before that, the crowd was already forming outside of the jail, across the street, as well as at the cemetery where the designated burial spot had been. Rashid was hanged at 8 a.m. in accordance with regulations. His body was not lowered from the gallows until 9. His family was admitted shortly thereafter, at which point about an hour passes, and then there are reports that the crowd has supposedly swollen to 5,000, 6,000. The numbers range, more than the authorities were prepared to count. Shortly after the body was ready for burial, the jail compound was actually breached. Fences were broken, mortar pillars were dismantled, and a couple dozen individuals came into the jail compound and ultimately did not leave until Rashid's father appealed to them and said that the state would not release his son's body until the compound had been released, or the compound had been cleared. While these negotiations are happening, the jail begins calling particularly to the fort, to request armored cars, to request infantry. They were not remotely prepared, and so they start appealing for reinforcements. Shortly after, the compound is cleared, the family leaves with the body. Now, I already went over the route taken by the crowd when they seized the body, but just to recap, because we're going to be looking at this map a fair bit for the latter portions of the presentation. They came out of the jail, they went north and west to Jama Masjid, the largest mosque in the city. They came out the other side, north again, and then as they begin to turn west, there's a police blockade while crossing the train tracks. Before they could reach the intended burial ground, which was part of a small complex as part of a Sufi shrine, the Dargah for Baki Billah, who's a 16th century Muslim saint and considered responsible for introducing the Naqshbandi sect to India. That's where they were headed. They didn't make it. Delhi officials arrested 131 individuals who were charged with everything from disrupting the public order, injuring state officers, assault, and theft of sort of the body, but also sort of not. Again, they never thought that there would be a riot at the funeral. They didn't anticipate the funeral itself getting out of hand. Ultimately, 15 or so were convicted specifically for theft, though not of the body, because bodies were not considered legal property. Instead, they were charged with theft of the shroud and the bier. So that which the body was being carried on, that which was laid over the body, but the body itself ultimately no one could be prosecuted for that theft. All right, so how did the colonial state make such a dramatic miscalculation? At the end of the day, one of the major shortcomings in their planning here is their failure to sort of contextualize and situate Rashid's death within a larger landscape. Because ultimately, no death, no funeral, no burial or cremation happens in a vacuum. Officials recognized that Rashid's family had an amount of claim on the body. They approached them and negotiated certain terms. And even though they denied the family's request to bring the body home for preparation, they did repeatedly reassure Rashid's father and his brothers that all religious requirements would be met, that all facilities that they needed to carry out these traditions would be available in the jail, and they assumed that was enough. Things would be straightforward as long as the family's expectations were managed, and the body would have a very straightforward, short journey, it's barely 350 meters from the jail to the burial ground that had been designated. Very short, both window of time as well as distance that they needed to maintain control over. They failed to account, however, for the fact that his family might not be the only ones who lay claim to Rashid, his death, and his body. Justified or not, at least some of Delhi's Muslims felt that they had some claim. They were outraged at the fact that he had been convicted and sentenced to death, whereas Mufti Mahbub Ali's murder remained unsolved, and those who had been charged acquitted. The press described Mufti Mahbub Ali's murder as being, quote unquote, a sequel to the Swami's murder, and for many, it represented the disparate priorities of the state versus Indians seeking justice. So for them, Rashid's execution represented whose lives and deaths were more or less valued. The state did also cite rumors that people wanted to take the body to either Jama Masjid, which they ultimately did, or to the shrine at Nizamuddin, about 3 miles to the south. For reasons I haven't been able to ascertain from the records, they seem to think that Nizamuddin was more likely, and so had already sort of collected a military presence at the train tracks to the south of the jail to stop that route, but were less convinced that Jama Masjid would be where the body would be bound. In looking at this, there are a couple of reasons why logically Nizamuddin doesn't work as well. First, it would have been a route much more easy to stop, in that by going south, it was more open country, much easier for vehicles to catch up with and impede another bridge going over train tracks and going over open country. Not to mention about 3 miles. So again, distance. It was the option that was probably more appealing to colonial officials in that it was the one more easily managed. But there were other factors as well. Since so many were charged, we actually know approximately where many of the individuals in this impromptu procession were from. Not only was Nizamuddin further away in its location to the south and much more exposed, but the old city would have represented much more familiar territory. The records do not indicate that any of those involved knew Rashid personally, but considering he had been living in Fez Bazaar, it's very possible. It's possible that he was a familiar figure, people had met him, and if nothing else, he came from or was living among a community that they might have identified with. I want to stress here that I am not here to debate whether or not these individuals had valid claim to Rashid's body or were exploiting an opportunity to cause havoc. because what matters here in this context is that at least some of the community felt justified. They felt that they had a right and claim to his body, and that they should have say in what happened to it and what it meant. This is further reinforced by the fact that at the criminal trial for theft and rioting that followed, multiple students and teachers at madrasas and schools in the area testified that schools had been closed that morning, specifically so that students and teachers could attend the funeral and participate in the funeral prayers, which undermines this idea that only riffraff looking to cause trouble were among those who showed up that day, which was one narrative that the state tried to put forward. Now that brings us to the question of infrastructure. And this is where we look at, to an extent, answer the question how the state was ultimately able to recapture the body and what that tells us about the way that the colonial built environment was having an impact on how people moved through and used space. So despite their poor reading of the situation, they were able to stop the illicit burial. They were able to reclaim Rashid's body. And there are three specific things that sort of played the largest role in their being able to effectively do that: in telephones, railroad tracks, and road networks. So the installation of telephone systems for police communication ultimately facilitated the placement of troops. It let them call and secure reinforcements in a way that would have been much quicker than earlier alternatives. And it also let them track movement of the crowd. I want to draw your attention to, instead of moving the mouse around here, this middle telephone symbol that I've put on the map there, which represents the Fez Bazaar police station, which we know from the records, multiple officers and sergeants in tracking the movement of the crowd would run back to so that they could phone their superiors at the jail, as well as the fort, as to which direction the crowd was moving, where people were headed, where they weren't headed, as well as the rumors and information about other clashes happening throughout the city. So they were able to disperse this information and make decisions based on it. The other thing is looking at a couple of recent roads, in particular, Garston Bastian Road, which had only very recently been completed in 1919, or at least that segment. It was part of this larger project to have a road that encircled closely the old city, and the portion between the Lahore Gate at the top and the Ajmeri Gate near the bottom of that dotted line, that had been finished less than a decade earlier. And that, along with Qutb Road, were ultimately how military trucks and police vehicles were able to get a large force to intercept the crowd with the body, as well as pin it in. And if they had not been able to move so quickly and efficiently to pin the crowd in on both sides, ultimately, it would have been much less likely that they would have resolved this, at least as rapidly as they did. They probably would have had to follow the body either all the way to the burial ground or back into the old city. And finally, the introduction of new train tracks. About 20 years earlier, the Delhi to Ajmer line sort of helped create this bottleneck where, in order to get the body from the old city to the Dargah where they wanted the burial to occur, they had to cross a bridge going over railroad tracks that were not previously there. And that really created the infrastructure in which it was harder for them to elude capture and sort of narrow down the ways and places in which the procession could cross over. So to sort of drive that point home, I just want to compare briefly a couple of maps. Here we have a mid to late 19th century map where we have the Lahore Gate and sort of a wide open area. There are at least 2 road paths that are available, but also there isn't a lot of other infrastructure closing in around them in that space. So room for both escape as well as routes to move the body. In contrast, in the early 20th century, in addition to the introduction of Garston Road, we have the introduction of this bridge and forcing fewer choices on movement between spaces, in particular between the Old City and spaces to the west. And so we see here that the colonial state sort of succeeds in reclaiming the corpse and enforcing their designated burial location of choice through not competent governance or an understanding of the communities and spaces, but because of built infrastructure already in place for other reasons that more readily allowed them to enforce the state's will. Over the course of this presentation, I've introduced multiple imagined routes to Rashid's final resting place. We have the one imagined by the state, quick, direct, short. Imagined by his family, where he would have first gone home and then to the burial ground. And then imagined by the crowd, where he would be taken to Jama Masjid for prayer and then on to the Dargah for burial at the location of Baki Billah's Dargah. 3 alternatives, none of which were realized. And so even though this case is an aberration, it sort of allows us to explore and tease apart the distance between these routes and the 4th route, which was the ultimate reality. It suggests that the colonial state failed to understand Rashid's death and funeral within a larger commemorative ecosystem, one that extended beyond him as an individual, beyond his family, even beyond his neighborhood, but to situate his death, not just in that limited context, but in Delhi at that moment in relation to other recent deaths like Mufti Mahbub Ali, like even Swami Shraddhanand. There were quotes from the crowd where people said that if there could be a procession for Swami Shraddhanand, so too for Abdul Rashid. And so thinking about his death in relation to those recent ones, to the extent that the colonial state considered his death as a Muslim, it was really limited to sort of the mechanics of ritual rites and to a little bit the politics of communal antagonism. They viewed it as a potential incendiary moment, an issue that could cause later outrage, but the ways in which they would manage that were in the aftermath, not in the event itself. And then it was sort of this disconnect between how they conceived of the death of a colonial criminal within a community that was both larger than the family, but smaller than the Ummah. And thinking about it within the physical space of the city and within the necrogeography of this particular region. So with that, I just want to thank everyone so much for attending today. I hope I didn't talk too quickly. I have my contact information here on the screen. And if I may, just before I pass it over to Durba to begin the Q&A, a brief plug for an upcoming digital humanities workshop that I'm a co-organizer of. We have 4 public lectures that, since we had to pivot to Zoom, now mean that you can attend long distance. They are all on digital map methods and connecting those to narration and storytelling in research and the classroom. So for more information on those talks and to register, you can go to tinyurl.com/undermapped.
Great, thank you so much, Kelsey. Nice round of applause. And thank you for demonstrating what can be done with critical storytelling and mapping. But with that, maybe I'll open up for questions, thoughts, comments. You can use your hand, you can use your whatever color your hand is. You can reaction, or you could just raise your physical hand if we can see you. Yeah, Niti.
I really enjoyed that so much, Kelsey, but I'm sorry I had to leave for just a few minutes in between, and so I might have missed this in your talk, but I had a couple of questions. I'm really curious to know how this fits into the larger work, the dissertation, and you talk about the alternative routes, and you talked a little bit, I think, about the trial and how so many students and teachers said that schools had been closed so that they could participate in the funeral. And I was wondering if during the trial, you also you might have mentioned this in your talk, and if so, I'm sorry I missed it, but did you also get reactions from political leaders of the time, like the Ali brothers and Gandhi? And the Hindu communal press must have just had a field day reporting on the capture and recapture. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for those questions, Niti. To speak to your first question as far as how it fits into the larger project, the dissertation as a whole is trying to bring critical heritage studies to bear on the histories of South Asia, the dead, and commemoration, and in particular trying to develop a sort of South Asian grounded or rooted grasp of the commemorative landscape, in particular one that is not strictly defined by either a handful of the exceptional dead or the white dead, and how up until really the present, historians have sort of perpetuated that focus of the colonial archives of which dead matter, and therefore how do they understand and interpret this commemorative landscape. And we sort of see that in this case and how it fails in defining it so narrowly. And then as far as political reactions, yes, as you probably, or as you did allude there, the Hindu nationalist press had an absolute field day. There were all sorts of lines about Shraddhanan ultimately becoming stronger in death than he was in life, particularly when it comes in terms of the strength of things like the Shuddhi movement. There were fundraisers throughout India raising money for it that were sort of combined mourning and commemorative events, but then also financial events. And then in the aftermath with the riot, you did for the most part have prominent Muslim leaders sort of denouncing the violence and pointing to sort of feeding into that question, like, oh, it was a handful of disreputable individuals who they don't represent the rest of us. At the same time, when the rare leader did point to disparities of policies and of treatment, they were sort of castigated in the press for those positions.
Great, thank you, Kelsey. Michelle.
Hi, Kelsey. It's good to see you. And what a fascinating talk. I'm just so impressed. My question is really, it kind of ties in to the previous question. I'm just thinking about 1927 as this really critical moment. It's a moment when anti-colonial politics across India really sort of see sort of a surge, and thinking about, the Simon Commission in the run-up to sort of what would become another campaign against the British. And to what extent, I'm just surprised that the Congress in particular wouldn't sort of pick up this as sort of a colonial state overreach kind of thing. And if you maybe see that later, or I don't know if there's any sort of larger context of the all India sort of politics that come to intersect with this like sort of very local event, if you will. So thanks.
Thank you. Okay, I have a lot that I want to say in response to that, so I'm trying to organize my thoughts and keep it somewhat brief. First off, one of the things that does seem to be significant about this is it does seem to be a particularly contentious moment that sort of sets off a sort of a series of protests around the funerals of executed individuals and the years that follow, in a way that had not happened previously. There had been debates within the colonial state going into the 19th century over this question of whether or not the state could refuse to hand over the body. But ultimately, the Congress never really latched onto that particular issue in this period. And there is a sense that this event is actually just inflammatory rather than a sign of larger concerns and sentiments. And so with these, I think it also helps embody that distance between elite interpretations of events and priorities versus how people on the ground are experiencing it and how they're choosing to act. We can't necessarily know what's going through their heads, but we can know to an extent some of what they did or the consequences thereof. And it was in this context that it also gets written off as Hindus and Muslims in Delhi are fighting about everything, a wedding, a funeral, you name it, it doesn't take a thing. And so it's viewed as sort of symptomatic of that rather than as indicative of something around the commemorative landscape.
Great, thank you. Other questions? So Kelsey, I know I should know the answer to this. But I'm gonna ask you anyway. I love the map, right? And I love the way that you demonstrated the choice to go north versus to go south, right? And you build up such an amazing suspense around it, but of course, it's obvious why they would go north, right? By the time you've told us, it's kind of clear. I guess one thing I'm just wondering about is it does seem like the local municipal authorities are replaying an old drama about the mutiny in Old Delhi and the gates along the west, right? And that there's a kind of, it's fascinating how they're replaying a kind of old set of mistakes, right? Both about making this landscape visible and navigable and manageable, but then just never really getting it right, So I think that's kind of interesting, and that's just an observation. The other thing is that, that they couldn't, that the theft of a corpse is not a crime, but the shroud is, which I also think is really interesting, right? And again, I guess I wonder if you can speculate a little bit about whether that is just something that they don't imagine, right? That this is an embarrassment in a way. And it seems like after the corpse is stolen, they're catching up, even though they've been anticipating that something like this might happen, right? So there's a weird kind of process at play I guess I'm a little curious about whether you see this as a new pattern or whether this is the old mistakes playing, replaying themselves.
So I think it is a little bit of both, as is often the case, in that even throughout all of there's an official inquiry afterwards, I think I mentioned, in that the India office informed him, how did this happen? What went wrong? How on earth did you have such a dramatic miscalculation? And at the top, they sort of had this similar response, like, well, it seems like it was kind of inevitable. There was already fighting. 1,000 people showed up 2 days earlier. How on earth did you not see this coming? So even the geography aside, why weren't there already army trucks on site? Also, why didn't you choose in this one case to bury the body inside the jail? And the answers from Delhi officials resoundingly are one, that burying the body inside the jail would have been, quote, contrary to ordinary usage. It's the only defense they ever really give, which I'm just like, okay, and. But they really hammer home the idea that none of this could have been anticipated. They keep saying there was just no way they could have possibly known. And in particular, they cite the idea that how could people who supposedly care about this body could treat it in such a disrespectful way and interrupt the family? And so there's all this language of that sort of the colonial state is appalled because if the reverence for the corpse is violated by Indians rather than by them. So sort of this language of like, oh, they're really the ones who are desecrating the dead here. So you have that. At the same time, this idea of a body not being property is ultimately tied to English law. And throughout the entire colonial period, it's never actually introduced in Indian law, because in England, technically, it was 1879, I want to say, in Williams v. Williams, where, and this is still the decision that gets cited today in not just England, but actually sometimes in Indian law, that there is no property in the dead body, that there's property in the estate, but that a body is only quote unquote legal property if it is donated for anatomical dissection or for a museum. So effectively it's property if it gets taken apart and used for those purposes, but outside of that, it can't be legal property. And that ends up being an issue, not just in this court case, but in other ones where they try to charge someone with stealing a body. And to an extent, they can't because the body isn't property. But what they sometimes are able to do is show that the right of disposal is a legal right of the whoever's in charge of the estate, according to the will. And that if that person's right to dispose of a body as they chose was violated, that's sort of chargeable as a civil case. But it comes up repeatedly and they sort of never actually get a handle on it and seem to always be caught off guard when they start to look for legal precedent and realize that legal precedent has left them sort of holding the bag.
Well, I mean, I think as I know from the other parts of the project, right, that these episodes are embarrassing for the colonial government, right? And it's partially compounded by the fact that the body has to be disposed of properly, right? It's a way of upholding the government's authority. But then you have these kinds of disruptions, right, to that imagination. And but I think you did such a fantastic job of showing us how the geography generated part of the conflict, both for the government, but also offered obviously an opportunity for the folks who wanted to claim Abdul Rashid's body. final questions. Yeah, Quinn. Quinn and then
Hi,
Quinn and then Umber.
Kelsey. This was great, fantastic, and you do such a really good job of presenting it through the visual, like the material you have, your maps, and you do a fantastic job with it. I hate to be the person who's like, let's just talk about the stuff that I'm interested in and completely disregard. But this property thing is fascinating. Does waqf ever come up in this, like Islamic endowed trusts? And I was thinking about it before with Fahi Bilal and why there and all these kinds of things. But I'm just gonna, as a writer, to this point that you were just making about the body can't be property unless these particular cases, like it goes to a museum or is used for anatomy. I'm trying to think about what the subterranean logic of that is. And if waqf, if anybody steps up and says, no, it is property, it's God's property, because it belongs to a waqf or something like that. Has it ever come up?
So
And if
I
not,
have not
just tell
seen
me
it
to
come up.
be quiet.
I have not seen waqf come up in terms of the body. Where it does come up is in the latter portions of the 19th century, as municipalities are passing more legislation that allows them to regulate the use of property as burial and cremation grounds. There is often this language of no body can be buried outside of like an official or designated burial ground, which implies that there was a system beforehand for designating something as official, and sort of there wasn't. And so you have these cases where sort of the waqf system becomes the mechanism for getting these Muslim burial grounds legally recognized and therefore protected, which sometimes comes down to people trying to prove that it has been held in trust, perhaps just not in a fashion that the colonial state is inclined to recognize. But in none of those have I seen waqf applied to the body. But if I do, you will be the first person to know.
Yeah, well, I mean, it makes sense that like they would think of real estate as being something that's waqfable, but you could imagine, yeah, they would struggle with the idea of a body being waqf.
Great, thank you. Umber, Abbas.
Hi, thanks. Kelsey, that was really so fascinating and I learned so much. I'm sorry if you can hear the work being done in my house, there's like some sawing happening. I was really fascinated by the construction of the geography and also the kind of tension that you set up between like the family as the only rightful possessors of the body, who are the only ones allowed to make any kinds of decisions, and the notion within sort of Muslim rituals around death that suggest that the community actually has a really fundamental role to play in the passage of the body and the soul from the state of living to the state of dying, but also that's very profoundly implicated within the geography of the cemetery and the actual placement of the body in the grave. And so I just was sort of astonished by the total absence of consideration for the community. I mean, obviously this is a political death, and so it has that set of meanings. But you said, that we're not trying to distinguish between the truth of a claim over the body and the meaning of a claim over the body. And I just wondered if you could expand on that a little bit in terms of thinking about the role of the community in death itself, maybe even less specifically to this death.
Sure. Well, I can sort of do it a little bit in both, because the language that you see in the disposal of the body and who the body can go to, in terms of, we'll say, the criminal corpse, to stick with this case, it often says friends or relatives, or relatives and friends. Sorry, don't quote me on the order. But the thing is, though, is that it recognizes that family by blood or marriage or any term that gets, or any relationship that is designated as fully familial, is not the only community that does potentially have claim on the dead. Sometimes, for instance, you'll see cases where the family and the community disagree. Perhaps the family is estranged. And then you have cases where, as as we'll hopefully be presenting together in Hawaii, inshallah, and next month, the idea that family might not be present, in which case the community in particular is a stand-in for this expanded community. So when individuals are not near their kith and kin, who stands in to make those decisions? And the idea that their larger community, whether it be religious, based on where they were born, any number of reasons that individuals are brought together, ultimately recognizes that there must already be some relationship and claim. With the migrant workers in California that I look at, sometimes it's individuals of the same caste, but often it's just other South Indians who are working at the same railroad company or the same agricultural plot of land. And so if nothing else, that makes them part of the community who has a right to make a decision in this case. Particularly in the case of Abdul Rashid, what gets interesting is that I was surprised the colonial state fairly reliably does not hold the family responsible. There are brief insinuations that because the funeral bier had these really long bamboo poles on either side that could supposedly support 25 to 30 people carrying the body, that, oh, Poppy, Michelle's screen, that they should have known that should have been assigned to the prison, that more people might be involved. But that actually fairly quickly gets quashed in that they recognize that as an act of devotion and of respect for the dead, members of the community may want, take turns often carrying, so as many people as possible can be part of that procession. And so they sort of put aside the idea that the family was involved. I'm not actually totally convinced that the family wasn't involved. I'm glad the state didn't pursue it, but it does seem that the family, there's no description of the father or brother getting into any sort of altercation when the body is taken. And when the body is reclaimed, it describes the family as, quote, patiently waiting at the cemetery for the correct cemetery for the body to be returned. And so everyone runs off with the body, and apparently there's like, okay, yeah, we're just gonna go wait for this to sort itself out. And so I read some of these sources as there being some extent of the family sort of giving the nod, so to speak, to it. But that's my hypothesis on it.
So I think this segues nicely into the question Neethi's posted in the chat. I don't know, you can see it probably, Kelsey, right? Neethi says, I'd be interested to know about the afterlife of this case. Do jail authorities take notes on disposal of the bodies and the potential to cause unrest, in quotes, and therefore act differently in the case of Bhagat Singh and 2 others 4 years later? Of course, there's, some of these from the hunger strike, right? The death of Jatin Das and so on.
So, I mean, it seems that there's a sense of it, particularly with Bhagat Singh, but I think we could point to like Ilham Dean's funeral and suggest that they didn't really learn very much. But what this seems to be part of is these debates keep happening, but they never actually really change policy truly, with the one exception, I feel, of the Bhagat Singh case, where they sort of innovate in a very strange fashion and then are surprised when it backfires. Because following the death of the execution of Kanayalal Dutt in Kolkata earlier in that century, that funeral didn't turn into any sort of riot or necessarily unrest, but it did turn into a huge public procession that officials were worried about. And so in the years following, a number of states tried to institute more policies against releasing bodies. And the India office actually questioned whether or not that was legally viable because of this idea that the body isn't property and that the death penalty is a discrete punishment, and after death, no further punishment can be meted out. And so what we have is a failure to change, both to change policies officially, recognition that it's a problem. And so then when they do act in a different fashion, they're almost always violating their own laws. And just this distance between what they expect to happen, what does happen. If anything, the biggest lesson they end up learning is to have larger military forces present and more police present in order to get crowds under control. Because some reason martial power is more effective than anything else in the state's eyes sometimes. Not always.
Well, thank you so much, Kelsey. So thank you all for staying past the noon hour. And thank you, Kelsey, for a really lovely and thoughtful presentation. I think we're all going to walk away with more thoughts and questions, and hopefully people take an opportunity to write to Kelsey afterward. But thank you again. And I will look forward to seeing all of you in virtual or in person, however that may happen as things open up. And on that note, happy Monday to everybody. Any final notes, Daniel or Gloria?
No, thank you, Durba. Thank you, Kelsey. We hope to see you at future SAP events, virtually and in person. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.